I'll just wait just a couple more minutes as people dropped in here. So. I'll just say welcome, and it's really wonderful to be able to have this session. Just in terms of a little bit of an introduction in terms of how we came to be here. I began a project with ArtsBuild Ontario with the support of ArtsBuild Ontario, whose mandate is to support the infrastructure for the Ontario. And at that time, there was a budding project here. I'm primarily in Ottawa. It was a community project that was a space that was coming up. Ultimately, we couldn't really do what we wanted to do from an Indigenous perspective in that space here in Ottawa, but it really gave me impetus to really reflect on where are our creative spaces across the province. With my history as an artist through the visual arts and then through theater and then through dance, just very familiar with the different kinds of venues, different kinds of spaces our arts really need to flourish. And that's where the collaboration with ArtsBuild really helped us to put this project to receive the funding needed and to go forward with the project, which has a number of different components actually, and it's really been wonderful to work through these components over quite a lengthy time of we're actually a little over 3 years now, and coming to a close or coming to the end of this project within this phase. Hopefully there'll be more, but let me just give you a little update on where we are now. So the components of this project were to celebrate the spaces that have been operating over the last number of years. So there were, we gathered, helped communities to basically tell their legacy story and recount their history and share really basically the blood, sweat, and tears of the work going in at a community level to create these spaces, to create them and to keep them going. And what's wonderful about the landscape here in Ontario is we have such important arts organizations and art spaces, and Woodland being an important one of those, one of the earliest ones, and to hear the history of the spaces in the early 70s when they came back to the community, and then the story unfold from there. So it's such a really interesting time and coming together of the fact that Woodland now is going through a transition / transformation, perhaps, through the legacy story as well as the community gatherings. And so we also supported communities to come together and talk about and dialogue what was happening, whether they had a community space or not, whether they had an art space that was fulfilling some of their needs or not. So that was a really interesting process as well with these community dialogues. We held both of these within the community there at Six Nations, or I should say through Woodland. And I was inspired, I was informed, I was educated, about the incredible history and leadership in a lot of ways for me in terms of the arts sector coming into a kind of a contemporary time. So it's we're really looking forward to this discussion today, this presentation. Of course, Janis is leaving the Woodland the center, moving on to another very important position, and I'm just I'm hopeful that, can I say this? I'm hopeful that some of the visioning, some of the commitment to what was discussed in some of the meetings, both the legacy stories as well as the community gatherings, will continue to be supported, because those are some beautiful ideas that were shared, beautiful thoughts, beautiful inspirations, and I just wanted to open it that way, just to say that's been a long, really wonderful journey with Woodland's been with the project all along the way. Hopefully that person that comes in will also be a part of the circle, because the idea is to really start to approach the work that we've done, the journey that we've had in connecting with these spaces, and to see that, or maybe work with that as an ecology for the arts in the province. We have organizations like the Center for Indigenous Theatre and Native Earth and Debauch. So there's lots of I think lots of opportunity to build this as an ecology going forward. So thank you for being here. Thank you for offering your wisdom and your words and your thoughts and your love to this conversation. And we welcome everyone that's here as well. And I'll hand it back over to Janis. Go.
Stego, go home to Yanga, Skinet Haga, New Go on Jonto, Otnawala, Nuagita Monto. Greetings, everyone. My name is Janis Monture. My Mohawk name is Gohondokta. Mohawk Nation Trail Clan from 6 Nations of the Grand River, and I am still the executive director of the Woodland Cultural Center, but only for a few more days. So I was really excited to be able to bring forward this dialogue today with two important people who are going to be continuing and have had a, amazing sort of intersection of history with the Woodland over the last 50 years. And really what we're going to talk about today is looking forward to the next 50 years. And sort of to talk about that, we have to understand a little bit about Woodland in the past. So for many of you out there who may not know Woodland, I'm just going to give you a brief overview, and I'm going to ask Amos and Tim to fill in some blanks if what they remember over the last 50 years. But Woodland Cultural Center was established in October of 1972 under the direction of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians upon the closure of the Mohawk Institute Residential School. Woodland Cultural Center started early on to focus a lot of its attention on collecting research and artifacts to develop a library and museum collection for the community. And in 1975, Woodland expanded into the arts and developed its first ever exhibition that still runs today, an annual juried art show called Indigenous Art. Currently, we have over 35,000 artifacts in the collection at Woodland, and it is one of the largest facilities in Canada that's managed and administered by First Nation. We do have 3 communities that we service. So locally, 6 Nations of the Grand River, but we also have 2 other Gnatgahaga communities, Mohawk communities, Wata Mohawks, which is located 3 hours north, and Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, which is located 3 hours east of us. And through that, our goal is to really preserve, promote, and strengthen our language, culture, art, and history, and really tell an accurate story of the Haudenosaunee people as a civilization. And we do this through innovative programming and exhibitions. We have huge historic expertise that is connected with Woodland. We work with a lot of local historians, traditional knowledge keepers, and our language knowledge keepers as well. Our goal through programs is to really promote and contribute to understanding the Haudenosaunee worldview and collaborate with other regional and national galleries. We also foster relationships at the community level with other Indigenous art organizations, but also with organizations that work in a number of disciplines that preserve heritage or work in performance, oral traditions, language, and cultural practices. The collection is significant because it houses a number of pieces that's specific to both 6 Nations, but also to our support communities. And a lot of our contemporary art collection was, again, gathered in the early 70s when Indigenous art was really starting to set a stage of itself on a national, international level. So we have, some Morissos and Alexandre pieces in our collection. We have Kent Monkman pieces in our collection, and we continue to build in this collection every year by acquisitioning new works into the collection. I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit and have Amos talk specifically about the language program, as he was the language director here for many years, and really to sort of provide a framework of how the language department started, and also really some really big milestones that the language department did during the course of its inception, I believe in 1983. So I'll turn this over to Amos.
Okay, yeah, Janis, Canos Waguego, the high horse Nick Wascaso, Nanto Canagra, here in Windsor, Nina, Kayan Kyo, no, Nick Wagas Jotan, Kanyatan, and Nick Wagas Southern. So my traditional name is the High Hoas, and it just happens to translate into he works with words, given to me by faith keepers, so I had no control over that name. Anyway, it became my career eventually. I came from the London Board of Education. They asked me to apply for this position for the first ever language director at the Woodland Cultural Center back in, I think I finally arrived in July 1984. And what was on our plate, my plate when I first walked in, was that they wanted to have the Woodland Center lead a pilot Cayuga language kindergarten. And they asked that I be involved with that, and I did with Reg Henry, the late Reg Henry. Sangohandita was his name. So he helped, and what transpired before I arrived in July, in March '84, there was a huge language conference in Sudbury with all the Ontario cultural centers, Secretary of State of the time, it became Canadian Heritage after a while, and also Indian Affairs. They had a big meeting there, a language meeting, and they broke up into caucus groups. And the Haudenosaunee caucus group, which Reg Henry and all the Iroquoian linguists or language experts gathered, they recommended immersion education as their top priority among the three caucus groups, among the Cree and Ojibwe or Muskego and Anishinaabe. And they also adopted that as a priority, number one, immersion education. So that's when the experiment, I guess, started. So as part of the language program, we did the community consultation. We had, in those days, you had to do a feasibility study for anything that you wanted to do. That's what Indian Affairs required of you. So we did that. And I basically say we wasted a year because it came back as a recommendation number one as well, that we would look at immersion education. So anyway, as that rolled over that year, the Mohawks also, the Gayan Kehono, they also wanted to be involved with a pilot kindergarten. So we did that. Woodlands was involved. Our first kindergarten was for the Cayugas was at the Legion Hall. The veterans gave us the Legion. And for the Mohawk, they used the old number one school. They took it out of mothballs and they cleaned it up, and that was for the Mohawk. And I knew two fluent speakers that might be able to become teachers. One of them was my sister, Lottie Key, so I conscripted her from nursing to come and join us and be our first immersion language teacher, and she loved it. Her and her parents used to clear the beer bottles and ashtrays off every morning at the Legion and built a kindergarten, half-day kindergarten. So we thank the Legion for that, and the veterans. And the Mohawks, Ima Johnson, Uncle Johnson was the Mohawk teacher, and I conscripted her from, at that point, she was doing busing. So she became our first Mohawk teachers. So, and her parents, they cleaned out the old number one school. And I remember one scene that they explained to me was that they didn't have money we had no funds here. So they used to use pails for the chairs for the students. So the parents donated pails to start the school, and that's what Ima had. And for her students. So all those little stories like that need to be collected and documented. We haven't done that yet. But anyway, that's what we started. But in the meantime, we kept advocating for the immersion school. And at first, the Department of Indian Affairs kind of frowned upon it because they were all about English education. So it took a bit of shaming to get them to come on our side. And it took the parents to say, we want to have these 2 kindergartens, to the point that they were civilly disobedient. They did not let their kids go back to school in September in the English stream program. These parents kept their students out. So it caused a kerfuffle a bit, but that was being civilly disobedient. And I'm really proud of that moment because it turned the tables around, the tides. So Woodlands was involved with kind of that advocacy work right from the beginning. We ran the tuition through the school system for Gawanio is what the name of the school became. It means the beautiful sounds. And we had kindergarten, and then each year the parents would add another grade. So now it's a full secondary, it's full school board, including secondary from K to 12. And it's on our own territory. And the parents proved to themselves that we could do it. And I think with the support of the elected council, especially Mr. Bill Monture, who just passed, he really advocated for us. And to me, that was self-government in action, because he took all of us who were involved as the advocates to a meeting in Toronto in the same boardroom with the regional director general, and we made our case with our feasibility study. So Bill Monture, the late Bill Monture, was a very strong advocate for our languages. In the meantime, my other work was to collect with faith keepers and elders the most extensive collection of ceremony and music of the Haudenosaunee, the Koniskis-Kehono, the Longhouse people. We used the technology of the day. Well, it was cassettes at that point, but then we had reel-to-reels as well, and then DVDs, and now it's all digitized. And we had lots of great help with that. Also on our plate was we created some dictionaries. We did one for the Cayuga English Dictionary. We published that. Onondaga English Dictionary, we published that. And a Tuscarora Dictionary, and we published that. So those are the main dictionaries that we created. And we had lots of help. We had, of course, Reg Henry was leading us. And Ima, folks like that, Ima Johnson, who were Mohawk speakers, all helped collaborate on these dictionaries. But also we looked at, again, collecting the greatest collection of music and orations of the Koniskis-Kehono, the Longhouse people. And it's all now, I'm so proud that at the end when I was leaving, we were finally digitizing all of that for safekeeping. We were able to do that, and we got a couple of good grants to do that. I know we went to Shirk with Dr. Carrie Dick, and we got just, I think, $16 short of $1 million grant for Cayuga language through her, and it was a community, university community access program, and that's what we used and we applied for, and we got this fund. And we're able to hire a lot of young people who are learning their language, and it was under the COOL project. We call it COOL, Keeping Kayokono languages. So that was the name of our acronym for the program. And it turned out to be very good, because we were starting to digitize all of our material. And then the students or the people who worked with us at that point got to know the collection and know that it exists there. And then we also, when I first started, it was kind of frowned upon us to interact with other First Nations that weren't supporting the Woodland Cultural Center at the day. But we kind of went around it. We created a language council. So then we had the Sweetgrass Language Council, and I had two colleagues, Angela Monture and Joan Greenberg. They really helped in my department to keep it going and keep it afloat. And we used to have professional conferences, best practices with our language teachers. And it kind of went beyond the borders of our supporting bands. And that's how we got around working with anybody that was not a part of Woodland. So that was a great achievement as well. And it's still going. The Language Council is still going. Well, since the COVID, we haven't been very active, of course. But now that it's over, we hope, and knock on wood, we can retain and regroup. So that collection is digitized. We did a lot of in-service training with external groups. We also became involved with the Six Nations Language Commission. I was so appreciative of my board at the time because it gave me a lot of leeway when I explained why we wanted to create a radio station, for instance, for languages. So they allowed me to work on that, allowed me to work on Gulwa Neo. And so anyway, and I think Janis can attest to this, once you become involved with Woodland, you tend to be asked to join a whole bunch of other boards. So you're kind of influencing a lot of other initiatives by way of the stature of Woodland Cultural Center. So that was great too, and I was glad my board was very supportive of developing those partnerships for the Woodland Cultural Center. So that was it. Those are some of the big crowning achievements for me. The other one, I guess they wanted me to speak on. I don't know if we're going to go there now. Was Save the Evidence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay, so I'll stop there. So that's
Okay.
Okay, I'll stop. Thank
Now,
you.
So we were talking about some of the really amazing things that come out of Woodland, and I think it's this very organic way in which we're able to work. We, even as directors, get a lot of freedom to do other work in our community because it's so intertwined with what we do. And also, we don't necessarily always get stuck in silos at Woodland. You'll see language do stuff at the museum, or the arts connect with language, or language works with the education department. There's always this sort of ability to go beyond just your department and make change or work with your colleagues. And that continues a lot today. And we've seen that actually happen a bit more because of COVID. We were all working virtually, so we all were able to connect on a more regular basis. And I think, what a lot of people maybe from the outset see a lot of from Woodland is the exhibitions that came out of Woodland, and really amazing partnerships that we did through the exhibitions. I'm just gonna highlight a couple. Tom Hill was very instrumental in really putting a mark on the museum sector as a whole with Woodland. Tom, of course, came from, working on Expo 67 in Montreal, which was really groundbreaking for Indigenous art, and then went on to actually Secretary of State as well, I believe, and then came to Woodland as the first museum, sort of museum art director, really, where you see the combination of both the museum and the arts. And Tom really did amazing things, and with that was, I think, a lot of the partnerships and reach that Woodland got with the exhibitions. So I think one of the first that a lot of people might remember was very early on in 1988 when he curated the exhibition Fluffs and Feathers, an exhibition on the symbols of Indianness. And this was done and toured across Canada and the United States in collaboration with a number of large institutions. And then he also created another quite critical exhibition in 2001 called Mohawk Ideals, Victorian Values by Dr. Alonia Deka, which was a partnership with the Royal Ontario Museum, so a provincial museum that we worked with this exhibition. And I'm also going to end it here with actually how Tim sort of intertwines is the exhibition that we also brought to Woodland that came from the Smithsonian Institution. Really looking at, the importance of Indigenous, not only historical, but contemporary in a larger sphere of music. And so, Tim, I'm going to have you speak a little bit about that collaboration that happened with Woodland with the Smithsonian.
Yeah, with Janis, I'm happy to talk about that. But if I could first, I just want to congratulate Amos. Kudos to Amos for all of the amazing work he's done with the Woodland Cultural Center on developing language. I think if you look at it over the past, few decades, it's really sort of transformed the community. There's a much greater awareness by young people who are seeking to learn the language, and general broad acceptance and commitment to language retention and preservation and strengthening of the language. So Amos, thank you so much for everything that you've done in that area. And then Tom Hill as well. You're right, Janis, coming as it were from a community-based cultural institution like the Woodland Cultural Center, nevertheless had an enormous international impact. I'm currently advising the Royal Ontario Museum on some updates to the exhibit that Tom worked on, the First Peoples Gallery, and the work that they accomplished there was truly exceptional. That exhibit's been up now for some 17 years. So I just want to highlight some of the significant work that's come from the center forward. With reference to the music exhibition, what Janis is talking about is Up Where We Belong, Native Musicians and Popular Culture, which was an exhibition that we developed at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. And that kind of got its start. I got hired there to oversee exhibitions and programs as Associate Director for Museum Programs. And we actually had a contemporary Indigenous music emphasis at the museum. And I was always amazed by the level of talent that was coming through, and the variety of genres that the musicians were involved with. And so we're looking at how to really strengthen that area, even beyond what it was already doing, to see where we could go with it from a programming standpoint, and then possibly some other areas as well. And what we ended up doing is conducting some research on Native musicians who either were successful to some degree in the popular music industry, either as artists themselves or as writers and things like this, musicians who influenced the sound of this music. And there was a book written by Brian Wright McLeod from Toronto, native guy, who wrote the Encyclopedia of Native Music. And it was like the full smorgasbord. I mean, everybody at the time was listed in there, but there were also some signature popular artists that you would recognize. And so we started looking at that. And then I had one of my researchers at the Smithsonian dig into it as well to verify that work and then look for other names. And what we realized along that road was that, oh my goodness, this is more significant than most people realize. We're talking about influencing the blues and influencing jazz, artists who influence jazz like Mildred Bailey, who was a Coeur d'Alene vocalist, who really set the standard for how jazz vocals sound today, influenced Bing Crosby, and we actually ended up making a film out of all of this. Well, let me not jump ahead too quickly. We produced a small exhibit at the Mall Museum in Washington, D.C. It was very popular. As a result, we decided to enlarge it, put it on steroids, put it in 4,000 square feet in the New York Museum of the National Museum of American Indian. Again, extremely popular. And because of its popularity, decided that we should really produce a documentary on it, so it doesn't just vanish, but really kind of makes the information permanent. So and that process also was quite compelling in producing the film. And we just kept coming across different artists who had substantial influence and contributions. I was mentioning earlier Mildred Bailey, Coeur d'Alene jazz singer, Tony Bennett. We interviewed him in his art studio in New York City. Said that from the age from 16 to 20, the only person he really listened to was Mildred Bailey. So you imagine influencing someone like Tony Bennett and how that then also permeates throughout the music world. Interviewed Robbie Robertson, who's from Six Nations. His mom is from Six Nations, and he was part of the band and played with Bob Dylan and tremendous influence there, and just a whole host of musicians that were just quite. Charlie Patton, the blues musician. Charlie Patton was out there, a Choctaw guy, creating the blues before anybody else, and so you can imagine how that has influenced generations of musicians today. So Buffy St. Marie. So, anyways, we just kind of hit upon this strand that was just quite amazing and came together quite well. We had always been looking at the Smithsonian, looking for crossover themes, where the larger audience, larger society would find an interest in something Indigenous, and really hit the gold mine, so to speak, with the focus on Indigenous musicians' contributions to popular music. American popular music, North American popular music is spread around the world, so that is enormously significant. So we that all took place, and then the Woodland Cultural Center said we'd like to have that exhibited at our center, and so we got that traveled to the Woodland Center. They did a great job with the installation and all of that. You guys may still have some memories of all of that and some of the music programming and so forth. The center's also been very active in music programming, Indigenous popular music programming for years and years. So a great synergy there, and a great connection between the Smithsonian and the Woodland Cultural Center.
Great. Yeah. So Woodland has really, like I said, it's really hard to put us in one sort of segment. Like, we're not just a museum, we're not just an art center, we're not just a language center. We are truly an Indigenous cultural center where we strive to do and meet the needs of our communities, our artists, and then the broader public to educate. And this leads to my next question for our panel, Tim and Amos. So in 2013, one of the buildings, there's two buildings on our site. One building was built in 1954, was the classrooms and gymnasium of the residential school. And then the other building, built in 1904, is the dormitory of the residential school. And the dormitory building was really starting to fall into major disrepair. The roof was leaking. Amos knows this very well, as the language department was on the third floor and getting rained on and pails everywhere. We were asked to conduct a community engagements process to determine from our community whether or not we would keep this former residential school building. And we did this over a course of 6 months, a number of information sessions, a number of outreach, radio, newspaper, mailing out, just trying to meet as many people in the community to get their feedback as possible. And at the end of the day, after the 6 months of consultation, and speaking to a number of survivors, we received a 94% in favor to keep the building. Now, keep in mind, this is just coming off the heels of then Prime Minister Stephen Harper's apology for the residential school policies, but not yet quite where things were going to turn. We didn't have foresight in what was going to happen. So we develop a business plan, we get, funding applications out the door, and then things started to shift, and really, really fast, in a way that I think surprised even us about what support was going to happen in regards to philanthropic support, but also allied support for us to keep this building, and then really what happened. So I went on to comment to another organization, and Amos was acting executive director during this time as this shift was happening. And Amos famously coined the campaign, which still everyone knows to this day. save the evidence. So I'm gonna have Amos speak to why save the evidence, who needed to be involved, and at the end of the day, what was the goal? And then we'll sort of talk about the different phases and where we're at now, and Tim will speak about that as well. Amos?
Okay, yeah, and Janis. Yeah, it was a good time, interesting time, because Janis had just left on a sabbatical, secondment, I mean. And so I got to delve into the research that they had conducted at the executive director's office, and to look at retrofitting or refurbishing the Woodland Cultural Center with the research that they had done with the community consultations. So it was on my plate to lobby our elected chief at the time, Chief Ava Hill, and we put our heads together, and we put out the campaign and pledge and challenge some of the neighboring communities. And the first one, of course, is Brantford. We went there, and of course, they met the challenge of our elected chief, Ava Hill, with a $240,000 pledge, I think, which matched the Six Nations elected council. So now we're near $500,000. And then we had the Rotary Club in Brantford. They donated $35,000, which was a lot of money in 2015, 16. Anyway, we were kind of excited about that. And this is before we went to any government funding. So we already had our communities were already engaged to help us. And to start, yeah, we had to have something that would sell our campaign. So we had a lot of meetings. I had meetings with some Holocaust survivors and their families about even use the word Holocaust to describe what we're trying to do. And we basically stepped back and said, no, we should not use that term, even though it was pretty, well, now we find out it was a genocide, but we stayed away from using the term Holocaust to describe our campaign. So we went back to our own community, our own survivors, and I talked with them, and they suggested names and words. And so I suggested to them, well, how about save the evidence? Because when you save the evidence, you save the school, you'll save the property. So that's the one we kind of jumped on. And I remember Blanche Hill, she said to me, she's in her 80s, former residential school. We're standing in a parking lot one day and looking up at the building. And she says, you know, Amos, she says, if we tear this building down, no one will never know it existed, except there'll be a plaque here. So we really got to try and save it. So that was sort of the impetus for me to use the term saved evidence too, with that conversation with an elder. And I always acknowledge her when I think back about that. So that's how we started Saved Evidence. And then we kept on going, and then Janis came back. So it was part of the executive director's role, because I was in that role. So she took it over. And I mean, she's going to go on with the next phases and how much money that they were able to gather for the restoration. But now at that same time was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report came out. There's 6-7 volumes. And there was a legacy, in the 94 calls to action, there was a legacy component. I forget what number it is, but it's kind of fit right in with what we're trying to do, is to honor the innocence and the grace of the 15,000 students that's estimated to have gone to the Woodland Cultural Center, the Mohawk Institute. And I always remember that, and those statistics. And nobody's challenged me, because they won't disclose those figures, but I always say it's 15,000 just by thinking and calculating. And I also remind ourselves as a community, in 1844, when they moved we Mohawks from Brantford to the reserve we have now, during that period in the 1840s, there was actually a whole village around the Woodland Cultural Center and the Mohawk Chapel. So it's been written that the area farmers came to burn down the homes and the stables that we were left behind, that we were forced to leave. And the village was gone. Wherever I can, I always remind us that there's been no reparation for that loss of home and dwelling and stables. So that might be on a next level of discussion. But in the meantime, we remind ourselves of that history of the 1840s when they moved us down to Grand River here to what the reserve is now. But they left the Mohawk Chapel and the Mohawk Institute. Everything else was gutted. So I always remind ourselves of that. And when I think about, when I talk at the academic level, and I've had some great opportunities with this, was I call this project or the outcome of what we're trying to do as a Canadian Museum of Conscience. And that's a term I use in academia when I talk about our efforts here at the Woodland Cultural Center. And they get it. I'm really happy that they get it, that we're trying to develop the Canadian Museum of Conscience. It's but the beautiful thing too that happened here, we're always looking for allies. At the time of Save the Evidence, I did a video because I was trying to figure out what can we do to create a campaign. So we created a video for our website, and I talked on there. And my opening introduction was, friends and neighbors, we need your help. So that's what triggered the former mayor of Brantford, David Newman, to get on board. So he created a civic group called Friends and Neighbors of Save the Evidence. And they were always alongside us, helping us morally and just to support us. And they also educated themselves at the same time. They used to have lots of, they had a number of lectures at Laurier University. So they brought Laurier on as a partner, and our staff and themselves as civic leaders, just people who lived in the city of Brantford, to educate themselves on this whole history of Indigenous people in this region. So really, I commend David Newman for his leadership in creating Friends and Neighbors of Save the Evidence. And it also supported us morally, I think, just to have another group supporting us outside the Woodland Cultural Center. And they've done some fundraising for us, and they kept it in front of the Canadian public in the surrounding areas. So I really commend them and thank them for that as well. And of course, our board members, we thank for having the vision as well to move on with the leadership, and then to pass it back to Janis. She'll talk about incorporating or engaging all the levels of government. So Janis?
Great segue. Yeah, so former elected chief Ava Hill here at Six Nations was such an advocate for this project, and still continues to be very active with us to this day and moving forward. We'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, we knew we were getting some really generous donations coming in from various organizations and municipalities and individuals themselves. But we knew we were going to have to raise a lot more money, and we were going to need the government help for this. The overall budget is $23.5 million. It has slightly gone up because of inflation right now, but we're still very close to that target. And we successfully raised the $23.5 million last December. We hit the goal that we had set back in 2015 when Amos started the campaign. We did it over 4 phases. So phase 1 was to refurbish the roof of the dormitory. And that was $1 million right there, just to stabilize the building and the roof structure. Phase 2 was to finish off the dining hall roof, and then improve the HVAC and electricity and plumbing throughout the building, and do some of the transformation of the spaces back to what it would have been, over the course of the 142 years the building was, open to the public, but obviously from 1903 to 1970. Phase 3 we are currently in. We are improving accessibility with the installation of an elevator and some exterior ramps, replacing heritage windows, and repointing and doing a lot of the masonry work that's required for the building. And that work is set to conclude by late summer of this year. And coincidentally, we will start phase 4, which is really looking at the interpretive plan and then also the site as a whole to become really this interpretive site of conscience for Canada. Our goal is to reopen in late 2024, fingers crossed, but it will be probably the first residential school building to open to the public when we open in 2024. So I'm going to segue this over to Tim to talk a little bit about what phase 4 is and what it looks like and where it has to get us to open to the public.
Yeah, Janis. Yeah, it's really interesting to look back on this history regarding the Mohawk Institute and that decision that the community made to not tear it down, which has been the decision of other First Nations communities across Canada, but to actually hold on to it. And these, as Amos was referring to earlier, these kinds of locations reside in the interstices of history, when and where there exists a societal desire to prevent the erasure of memories in order that future generations are able to learn lessons from the past. And that's the decision that the community made as a whole. And I think it's a really wise and, in fact, courageous decision that was made. And the power of concept, the power of thought, the power of idea, Amos, save the evidence. I mean, that's a brilliant idea. It's a slogan, if you will, a catchphrase that really captures people's imagination immediately, and it's germane to all of the objectives going forward for the Mohawk Institute. As Janis said, we're now starting to launch phase 4, which is to develop the full interpretive plan and the heritage site experience of the Institute. And what that experience will be is what was it like for the young people who went there, for the children. And so we want to take visitors through that experience just as the students would experience it. And in this particular case, because we're really looking at more of a heritage site of conscience, we don't need a lot of gadgets. We will need to provide enough interesting ways in which people will consume information about this history, Canada's policies in residential schools, and also the life experiences of the students who went there, but also the legacy. There has been, generational trauma that's come out of all of that experience, and I don't think there's a single family of ours at Six Nations that hasn't been affected or impacted by it. It's enormous, and so we can't really overstate the importance of the work that began with the community and the Woodland Cultural Center on moving this forward. So within that experience, the visitors will be sort of toured through the Mohawk Institute, understanding what it was like when the students first arrived there, and the dramatic changes, cultural shifts that they had encountered, behavioral shifts coming from loving families and families where they knew everybody to this kind of rigorous authoritarian experience that they all had, siblings being separated. The girls and boys put to different sides of the building and wouldn't be allowed to talk to each other, so they could on occasion see their siblings but not really have any communication with them. And then the very dramatic experiences that took place. We have to give a lot of credit to the survivors. Each one of these stages that Janis was describing, really the survivors have played a leading role in helping everyone to move through the process and understand what took place at the Mohawk Institute. And we've met with them several times. Everybody's, who's been involved with this work has been met with them, and there'll be more meetings yet to to get their insights and advice on various aspects of the project. But it's, the stories are really, it can be very, very heavy. And so, we have to determine in this phase 4 how we're going to treat that, appropriately, to be true to history, but also sensitive to how it is that we express what took place at the Mohawk Institute. So, the visitors will get to see the sort of the dormitory rooms, classrooms, the dining hall, the basement areas where some bad stuff took place. I mean, and then just the name of the common name of the school is Mush Hole for the terrible food that was fed to the students, even though they were kind of actually working on an active farm. They were fed this terrible porridge and so forth. So there's a lot to deal with in working through that whole process so that we take people on a journey. And I think Amos, not necessarily unlike the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where you learn how did this all get started? Where did it begin? How did it begin? How did government arrive at these ideas? And oftentimes it didn't happen like this. It took a period of time, and then how are these policies then implemented and by whom? And then the various levels of abuse and harassment that took place. But also, there is some contrast here too. Depending on what happened to the students, they would have different recall and different memories. So some came through relatively feeling okay, where others experienced some of the worst things that you could imagine. So it depends on your own journey through that school system and what took place during that time period. Now, one of the things we were looked at as a group here, and I can tell you that we put together a really wonderful team, really a top-notch team to implement phase 4. Myself, I come from the Smithsonian, where I spent 11 and a half years there, 10 of those overseeing exhibitions and programs, the National Museum of American Indian. Rick Hill, a historian, is leading this project from that side. Also a Smithsonian guy from the past, and it's done a tremendous amount of research on the history of the Mohawk Institute. We're working with Lord Cultural Resources on the interpretive planning aspect of this. They are one of the global leaders in dealing and working with cultural institutions. Our design group, internationally renowned, Weatherston Brewer, and then our fabrication group, also internationally renowned, which is Cubic Multi. So we put together really a top-notch team to do this work because we think the importance and severity or significance of this project is so high. And I think I would agree with both Amos and Janis that if this is the only Indigenous or Indian residential school that's treated in this fashion, it's going to become a huge thing, and going back to the community direction that was provided to restore this place so that these memories can be kept and learned from, I think is really critical. So the site's extremely important to the community and also the other Indigenous communities whose students were taken and transported here, but also to the country as a whole, to the country of Canada, I should say, as a whole, because of what it means and how it reflects on the country's history as well. So a lot of work to undertake in the next 2 years, Janis.
Yes, and one of the things I wanted to sort of speak about is how the Mohawk Institute restoration is so highly integrated with the cultural center and how we're not going to lose a part of that. And one of the things when I first came back and Tim and I started talking about, this next phase that's going to have to happen, I said to him, there's 2 things that have to remain in this building. First and foremost, the language department. The reason the language department has to exist in this building, and it will remain on the second floor on the boys' side, is because the children here were not allowed to speak their language. In fact, they were punished for it. And the residential school policy in this country was a major contributing factor to the loss of our languages, which is why our Haudenosaunee languages today are critically endangered, are considered critically endangered languages. For me, and the vision for the board of directors was, you know, we want these walls to hear, to have it on the walls in the language department, to see people speaking it, to see the transcriptions, to hold our very precious recordings of our ceremonies and our music. That is so vital. It's a way for us to reclaim this space, to show that despite this institutional policy to strip us of our language and culture, we are still today working and thriving to revitalize it. And the younger generation is really taking up this challenge. And we're seeing more and more in the language programs. They're actually probably overextended in regards to enrollment because they just can't keep up with the demand that's happening in our community. And Amos, I know you can talk a little bit about that too. But it was so important that the language department remain in the building. And when visitors come through, they're actually going to walk through the language department. They're going to see, they're going to hear, because we want people today to realize that despite all of this, we're still here and we're still speaking and practicing. And the second part that's going to remain in the Mohawk Institute is our library, because our knowledge was kept from our people. It's also a place where our library, you know, what records we are going to get back, and working with the survivor secretary and the government, is that to have as much as we can, the list of the names of the children who came through here, so that there's a place for them to go, but also for our own people to have a space where they can go to learn and to have access to our resources. A lot of our resources in our research library is, you know, written by our people and studied by our people. So we want that space to remain, and that will remain on our first floor. So despite it being, yes, it's going to be an interpretive site, and it's going to be the site of conscience to remind Canada of what the system policies did, it's still going to highlight the work that continues at the Woodland Cultural Centre. The third floor will be some staff administration offices and programming staff offices on the third floor for a bit. It may become a creative space as well down the road, but that's what will happen in the next, 4 to 6 years, we foresee. But it's so important that people walk away with an understanding of the history, of the legacy, but also see the hope. See what the future is and what is happening. I have a very dynamic young language team here at the center who all came out of the immersion program that Amos spoke about from the 1980s and 90s. And you see them now as the new leaders of our language, and they're fighting. And the research, my librarian also coming from this younger generation who's saying, yes, we need to do this, and this is what we need to make available to our communities. So this is just sort of some of the things that will continue to be. I don't know if Tim or Amos, if you wanted to sort of chime in there.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with, I had the opportunity and privilege to hear a ceremony about 2 years ago. And as you know, some of you might know, we sit in moieties within the longhouse. One set of clans across from the other set of clans across the fire. And I was taken back. It just dawned on me, the 2 gentlemen or 4 gentlemen that were speaking back to back were totally bilingual and were alumni of Gawaneo. They sound like seasoned elders or faith keepers, to the point where I have to say, after 35 years, one generation, that's our reward, I guess, at the Woodland Cultural Center and in this community. I was taken to tears because I got to witness this. you know, when they told us it was not going to happen. They're going to only learn about witchcraft. They're not going to be able to speak English. We had all of those critics in our own community. We were so colonized back in the 80s. I always say that, that we didn't think there was any value of our traditional civilization. So now when that's when I'm at this point in my life where I'm going to look at retirement, I'm glad of what Woodland did. That the leadership that they provided in this area to recover, restabilize our languages. Um, and I mean, it takes a lot of people to do this, but you know, it was the institution of the Woodland Cultural Center that led that charge. I mean, yes, I was employed at the time, but still you need a board that supports you. You need colleagues, you need staff that support you, and you need community partners. And that's what happened. And now we have bilingual adults after one decade, after, you know, I mean, not one decade, one generation. And I just wanted to go back too and remind us, you know, when we first started Save the Evidence, and this is probably a great attribute to our, attributed, I mean, to our education, to our staff, talking with young people, students. The students would go back to their schools and have bake sales, cake sales, those small things that the students thought they could do to help with Save the Evidence. I just take that back and I think about that. I mean, yes, there were great donors too, but to have these young people find it in their hearts to have a cake sale or whatever sale they could have, and they would send that money in with a, you know, with a check, and the teacher would bring it or something. I thought that was so heartwarming and supportive of the survivors to see that. So I just wanted to mention that too, that that's what happened with us with Save the Evidence. Now, that's enough for me.
Yeah, and Janice, I think the inclusion in the renovated Mohawk Institute building of the language and library or knowledge components are great, because it's going to make that facility feel dynamic. It's going to communicate those messages that you articulated, and it's going to transform the energy of the building in a way. So I think that's really really good thinking by you and your team on making those adjustments. So it's not just simply sitting there as a heritage property, but as a dynamic, active part of the community, and you know, continuing the knowledge and language and history and so forth, but also you know, educating the public. So I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, I think at first, when I first brought this forward to the survivors, I think I could see some of them be like, "You're not going to do the whole space?" And I was like, "Well, you know, majority of it, of course." I said, "But you know, I want to talk to you guys about this because it's really, I think, in a way, important for us to realize that I think just how important it is to reclaim those space." And I think they were like, "Oh, okay." Like after I told them the reason, because at first they were not, I don't think they were totally on board when I like sort of pitched it to them. But then afterwards I said, "No, it's still part of it. Like you can still say this used to be this space. However, today it's now this space." And I said, you know, to have that ability to talk about it historically, but what we're doing now and why we exist as a cultural center, it's so important to the space, and really that I think sort of speaks to when you look at the 50 years coming forward, what do we see Woodland as, or where is it going to go? And I think that's a lot of questions for, like, when I pose to the past, like, where do they see Woodland in 50 years? Because that's a question I commonly get, specifically because it's our 50th anniversary this year. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on where you think Woodland is going to be in 50 years.
Well, I think following up on what you said, they're reclaiming, not just reclaiming space, but reclaiming our agency. And I think, you know, when we look at the sweep of this history, and you wonder how in the world were our kids taken from our homes? You know what I mean? And you have to go back in time in terms of what the conditions were like then. You know, the disempowerment that existed, the frame of mind, the almost the adoption of colonization, if you will. You know, by people who were victims of it. So I think this whole process is about really regaining and reasserting our agency, and making sure that we move forward into the next 50 years in a way that truly reflects that. There are so many issues that can grow from what's discussed at the Mohawk Institute and the Woodland Cultural Center, that I don't think there's any limit to it. Conceptually, there's no limit to what the possibilities are, particularly with all of these elements coming together.
Amos? Oh, you're sorry, you're muted still.
Yes, Janice. Well, we always wanted to have the Northern Thunder Performing Arts Center there.
Yeah.
And that's always been my dream. I know the first time you went on a secondment, I kind of gathered my thoughts and about where we could be. So I found some funds to hire an architect to look at and dream up the Northern Thunder Performing Arts Center on the grounds of the Woodland Cultural Center. And we got a lot of support, even at the university level, about, this could be very good for all of us. But because at that point I was thinking we need to have a venue that is wholly managed and owned by First Peoples in this country. One doesn't exist that at the time that I knew of a performing arts center that was wholly managed and owned by First Nation community. So I went to work with that, and we hired a local architect to design what could be a full theater with meeting rooms and an amphitheater at the back, and all of this for summer productions. And anyway, it was I always thought that's where we could go. Of course, life changes, life happens, and we had to do the restoration. So first, so hopefully in 50 years, the young people will think about that, and maybe they'll have their own performing arts center, if not on the property somewhere on Six Nations. That's wholly managed by us. Anyway, that's my hope anyway.
Yeah, well, you'll be happy to know. I think it'll be coming out very formally soon, but we are building a new cultural center for Woodland that's on the map. It's very, very early on, but it's in there. And Amos, I put a theater in there just for you because of our thoughts about this back, Our goal was always to build a new cultural center because our current museum and galleries is housed in the classrooms and gymnasium with a couple additions. It was never meant to actually be a museum or an art gallery. It was never built to be that. So it doesn't function really fully as that. And so we're very early on, and I know both of you will probably see them very soon. I'll be sending you some information soon, but we are looking, and I think this also sort of spurned again because we were coming to the close of this restoration with the Mohawk Institute. I said, okay, Amos, I do remember this. I remember seeing TNT in the boardroom. I remember the plans, and I was like, and in my mind, I thought, we need a new cultural center. At the end of the day, we need a new cultural center space. That's more, like I said, more organic in the way in which we program and the way we service our communities and our artists, and just to have it more of a space that's more communal for everyone that has everything. And I used to think back to as well, Tim, when I would spend time at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington. And I thought that's such a good space because there's theater, there's, this big atrium that you can gather. And then you still have the outdoor space to hold concerts. And I thought, one day Woodland will get there. And I'm happy to say we're on that path. And I think a lot of that discussion to get back on that path really came as a result of our participation in this Indigenous creative space, because we started meeting with some artists and community partners, and they kept saying, we need a new space in the community. Where is it going to be? Should it be back at Woodland? And I said, well, why not? And as I thought more and more, and I would talk more with people, I kept hearing this, yes, there needs to be this space. And so I proposed to our capital committee, who work on these larger scale projects, you know what? I want something that is not either the same size as the Mohawk Institute, if not a little bit bigger. So we're looking at a 40,000 square foot new facility at Woodland to really show people across Canada that we can exist within this space where we talk about the past, but we really want to showcase the present and really, and that's really key.
And great synergy. It's all really great thinking, Janis, and great synergy too, because when the Mohawk Institute comes online, so to speak, and is active, people then, more and more people will be coming out to that area, and then having the opportunity to offer these other experiences as well, top-notch professional exhibit design spaces, galleries,
Yeah.
Theaters. I mean, we had the theater and the National Museum of American, and we had several performing spaces actually within the building, but within the theaters, around a 300-400 seat theater, great for concerts and things like that, but also lectures and conferences, things of this nature where people can sit comfortably for several hours, and so it really aids the learning process as well. And I think that'd be fantastic. Coming out of the music exhibition and the film Rumble, the Indians Who Rock the World, I produced a traveling concert called Rumble the Concert. And then in March of just coming up in March, we have another concert coming out that still rolls out on the heels of the work that we did for the Up Where We Belong exhibition, but this is called Treaty, a Reconciliation Revelry. And so again, it's a musical concert, but it's designed to educate people about this history and legacy that Indigenous peoples have been dealing with within the country. Highly entertaining, but also informative. And so spaces like that then create the conditions and the environment for that type of learning. Oh, and the concert's coming to Sanderson Center on March 30th.
I know, I have that in my calendar. Yes.
Plug in there.
Great. I'm gonna leave I guess before we go, I might take some questions from participants. If there's any, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. There is a couple in there already. JP had asked a question about, he's got two questions. Amos, I think he was wondering what year was it that the immersion school came into play?
Okay, that came in after our feasibility study that we conducted. It was known as a Jessica Hill report. She was from Oneida. She conducted it, concluded that in 1985. So it was 86, I believe, that we started the first kindergarten Mohawk and kindergarten Cayuga. And
So amazing.
We had no funds. We had
Yeah.
hired these teachers and without a guarantee of a salary. So they took it upon themselves because they believed in it to go without a salary, I think for about 2 or 3 months, if I recall, until we negotiated a tuition agreement that would flow through the Woodland Cultural Center.
Yeah, and it's amazing to see that because there's a lot of those first kindergarten class teach now and actively teach in the community. Yeah. The other question that JP had asked us was, how do we create a stronger connection of our languages with our contemporary arts practices?
Well, I think that we have to make languages a bread and butter issue. And what I mean by that is that we've got to try and source out grants for people who can write theater, compose lyrics in their language, just like they do for English. So I think if we can find a benefactor that would support that, then we can also include that as part of the arts education of our immersion students or our alumni. I think that's what we need. We have this repository of speakers of language. They want to do some creative things. We need now to source that and create our own granting system or a grant. And I would look to ActDev to maybe look at that, or some of our funding that comes externally to the community to set up almost like an arts council that would support our English artists and our language artists in composing and creating, whether it's film or, as I said, lyrics and music, or plays, theater, that kind of thing. I think that'd be really important in the next 50 years too, to have that be established on the territory. I don't know if that answers the question or helps to. respond to that.
No, I think that's great. JP?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really wonderful. Both of those responses, Amos, I appreciate that.
Mm.
I just wanted to actually change my hat a little bit and come from the idea or the perspective of an artist that's been practicing over the last 35 years, from visual art into storytelling and theater and then into dance. So from my perspective, first of all, I have to be very grateful for the culturally based professional training that I've received, both in theater and in dance. My visual art education was much more in terms of the institutions of the University of Michigan and the Ontario College of Art and Design. So being a senior artist now, realizing how important that culturally based training is, and then also becoming very aware of creating artwork. So the process of creating our Indigenous artwork, that's one thing that really needs to be supported. And the idea of what we're creating for, what the spaces that we're creating for, like a proscenium theater stage, that's a Western stage. That's a colonized stage. So for the last 30, 40 years, as our contemporary arts has developed, we've been very affected by those spaces. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of a self-determination of how we work, how we create artwork, to then be shared, exhibited, or performed. So I just wanted to share that. That's part of the conversation that's happening within the scope of this project, and I think really needs a lot of reflection and importance played on it, in that it's done in a self-determined way. And of course, language and our oral traditions are going to be the foundation of that. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
JP.
I just want to continue on that because it's consistent with our conversations. I think, these cultural centers and art centers like the Woodland Cultural Center are so critically important to the community. We're all active also in our contemporary lives. We all consume a lot of television and content that's not produced by ourselves. We've been raised reading books that aren't necessarily written by ourselves, and histories that aren't written by ourselves. And so centers like the Woodland Cultural Center, retain that history, retain that knowledge and pass it on, ensure that members of our community have an understanding of their culture, their identity, an understanding of the civics, Indigenous civics, how we fit into the governance side of things within our own communities and within our broader society. So I just think that it's just so valuable and so important to have these types of centers in our communities.
Yeah, and JP, to answer your question about even the space itself and even the future space of Woodland when it hopefully comes to fruition very soon in the next few years. One of the things I thought of immediately when I was thinking of the theater space is when you go to Longhouse, how we sit is, kind of more in a rectangular shape, but we sit on the outside and the dancers and singers are in the middle. So it might be termed a black box theater in Western terms, but that's how we see when we look at space when we are together, and it's how we gather for social. It's the same idea. We sit along the exterior, and in the middle is where the magic happens, right? It's where we hear our songs and we dance. And so when we thought of the theater space in this new build, that's literally what our concept was that it's going to be kind of like a black box theater as per architectural standards, but in the way in which we use the space is very similar how we sit in Longhouse. And we wanted that to be reflective, not to mimic it, but to be reflective of that and how we are in our culture. So that's something we're very intentional about in the space that we're creating. And
Yeah,
even how, sorry, yeah.
The circle is central to our performance culture, whether it be ceremony or whatever. Okay, the circle
Yeah.
is. So I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
I just have to emphasize the other part though, the part around creation, the part around to me, the reclamation process of our arts is actually creation and recreation.
Mhm.
And so how do we do that in a way that's congruent to us as a cultural people? I don't find actually as a contemporary performer that I can't go anywhere to find the resources I'm looking for. I want to continue land-based training, land-based work that comes out of our base relationships with the earth and the water and the air, which is central to our cultural expression. So if we're creating more institutionalized spaces, is that really providing what we need or maybe need in the next 50 years? So.
Yeah, we've looked at that as well from a programming standpoint. So a lot of our programs have shifted to land-based. That's something the language and cultural department really focuses a lot on, because it's hard to like learn just in a classroom setting or in a theater setting necessarily. And for a lot of artists, they'll say they need to be within in the grounds of the space. So that's where our new cultural center space, actually all of the entrances and outlooks that you see is so intrinsic to the exterior and interior that we try really hard to have this fluidity between the space. So when you look outside, you see it. If you don't, it's good. Place-based learning. Yes, thank you, Tim. It's very much congruent to what is happening. And that's what we're seeing really take shape here at Woodland, and will continue, I think, for the next 50 years for sure. But yeah, so I'm going to leave us with some final thoughts. I'm going to lose a panelist very soon. So I just want to end with Tim and then Amos for some final thoughts as we close for today.
Boy, wonderful discussion. And I'm just very encouraged by the direction that things are going at the Woodland Cultural Center. And we are going to be busy over the next couple of years working on the Mohawk Institute and all of these integrated elements, the language, the knowledge, all of this is really critical to keep in mind as we move forward.
Great. Noah, Tim, Amos? Oh, you're on mute again.
On mute again. Okay. My final words were, I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to work at the Woodland Cultural Center as a career in languages before I went to the University of Toronto. I appreciated my board and the survivors as well for pushing us as staff at the Woodland Cultural Center. As you know, they're also going to complement the restoration with their own park, Memorial Park, the survivors themselves. But I just wanted to share, I think when we first, Stephanie Pyle and myself were in a room trying to think about things and drawing stuff on a board about what we wanted this campaign to be. We started with save the, you save the witness, you save the evidence, or is it going to be save the evidence, you'll save the witness? Anyway, stuck with save the evidence. We combined them all. So that was the phrase that we used. So again, that saved, if you save the evidence, you save the witness, or if you save the witness, you save the evidence. So it was a back and forth deciding on how to land on save the evidence. But I just wanted to acknowledge, we did this work, I think, to honor the integrity of the innocence and the grace of all these students that went there.
Beautiful.
You know, they came there very innocently with their grace, not knowing what they were getting into. So I just I know that was empowering us when we started this campaign for Save the Evidence. And I just wanted to make sure that our listeners and our students or whoever's on this call today understand that that was the driving force, is to honor that legacy. Nyawa go.
Now we go.
Noah, Tim, and Amos for your time today and for sharing the panel with me to have this discussion about Woodland. It was so important to have you both here because you're coming at different junctures of Woodland's history. And I just want to say now to everyone, thank you for listening to hear about Woodland's story. And I'm also very excited for what the next 50 years are going to be for Woodland. And again, like Amos said, we do this work because we love it. And I'm so appreciative of all my mentors over the years. Tim and Amos, also mentors to me in the work that I do, and Tom, of course. Just really, I learned so much from all the staff here, and the board has been amazing through this whole process and really supporting the vision. that I've had, but also many before me have had. And yeah, I'm so thankful to have been here for almost 16 years off and on in this capacity. And I'm very excited for the next 50 years. So thank you again, both of you. And to everyone, I wish you all a wonderful day. And I look forward to seeing what great things come from Woodland.
And we have to remember, Janis, this is what gives us our purpose, right? That's
It
the most
does.
important thing. Our purpose.
Yes. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Now,
Ona.
I don't know.